All right, we're talking property here on the program. We're talking property and land, and it's quite an interesting survey that's been done. Oh, actually a study into the sector, but this is just one of very many studies into the sector that the organization has done. And joining us here on the program to talk about this is Vuyiswa Mutshewane. She's the CEO of the South African Institute for Black Property Practitioners. So before the break, we're going to move on to the issue of land. It wasn't necessarily done in this particular study, but I was reading some of the interesting findings, and this is quite, I think it's quite telling, and perhaps South Africans will heed to this number. The total South African land mass equates to 123 million hectares. Right. By 2013, land reform or restitution programs had seen only 7.95 million hectares transferred to black people. 47% of land is privately owned by non-black owners versus 22%, which is currently classified as black owned, which includes communal and private ownership, and 21% is owned by the state. This transformation that we're talking about in the land debate here in South Africa, I mean, when we look at these figures, it's needed. Is that the conclusion?
It is absolutely needed. You know, the land discussion is a very multi-tiered discussion. There's definitely a land restitution question that comes into play in terms of people who have land claims, and I think that's the number you referred to, the 7%.
Yes.
You know, in 2013,
7.95 million hectares.
7.95 million hectares, and so there's that aspect of it. But the part really that we haven't started to deal with is the urban land redistribution and productive use discussion. You know, in terms of the Department of Human Settlement, for example, we have a 2.2 million housing backlog where people are just looking for shelter. They are just looking for houses. They've put in applications, you know, to the Department of Human Settlements, and there's a backlog. Now, where's that? Why should there be a backlog? When you and I, we drive down the street and we see
vacant land
everywhere, and it's sitting, and the local municipalities are more often than not the custodians, you know, of that land and how that land gets used and apportioned. And obviously some of it is privately owned and some of it is state owned. But really the discussion that we need to be having is, how do we ensure that each and every South African, number one, is adequately accommodated for, is given the necessary dignity, you know, that housing and shelter can give them, and that all the land in South Africa is used productively. So we need to start having a more constructive discussion about land reform and land use, and say, how are we going to ensure that people have access to title deeds? How are we going to ensure that people have housing and we can deliver on that housing, and that development is fast-tracked? And to what extent does private sector need to partner with public sector to deliver on that housing mandate? Because really, that's the issue. You know, I think by and large, you know, and we've seen we've seen it happen where people who have been beneficiaries of land claims, even after receiving their land, would go back and sell it, you know, because ultimately the owning of that title, owning of that land is an economic utility. And once you have it, once you have access to it through a title deed, of course, it's your right to do what you want with it, you know? And I think that's where we need to start getting a little bit more technical, a little bit more specific about what are we talking about when we talk about land reform. And really, with 70% of the South African population living in urban areas, the discussion needs to be about urban land reform and how do we use urban land more productively.
Love it. I think it's a conversation we need to take forward, but I'm glad we touched on it, because I think people do need to know the fundamentals of exactly the studies that go into it and the breakdown that you've explained to us. So Vuyiswa Mutshewane is the CEO of the South African Institute for Black Property Practitioners. What a pleasure it's been talking to you. I think this is the first of many invitations. We need to have you more on the program to talk about this vital issue. Thanks very, very much for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
All right. Let's take a break here on the program. 8 o'clock, we'll bring you your news. Stay tuned.
When I decided to resign, actually I put in my resignation letter. The owner of the company didn't actually accept it. When I left, he was supposed to pay me my 2 months salary. He didn't do that. That's when